And I'm always very, very mindful of the generational pile-on that we see happen. Like the young people are, and then you like fill in the blanks. Disrespectful, don't know their place, disloyal, flighty, all the rest. Hey, the same thing was said of Gen Y or millennials and Gen X and baby boomers. We sort of always say this. What I would say is if you look at Generation Z, there are some great things, but there are some tricky dynamics we do need to deal with. And if we look at some of the key characteristics of this group as they come through and impact the sector significantly in the years ahead, the first thing we're seeing is they tend to be incredibly purpose or values focused. And there's lots of things we could talk about around this, but one of the big ones is around sustainability. And a lot of what we've seen even at this event around sustainability, the reason it's front of mind is because this is increasingly the expectation of our delegates, especially those younger ones coming in who they'll look at all the single-use plastic and paper and they start asking questions and pushing back and complaining. And it's interesting too, like we're seeing this play out in lots of ways. So a little while back, a company that many of you know named Etsy shelled out $1.6 billion to buy an app that I'm guessing some of you never heard of called Depop. Who's never heard of Depop before this moment in their lives? Hands up if you haven't. Okay, so ask a teenager, they'll tell you all about it. Depop is one they love. It's an app they use to buy and sell used fashion and accessories. It's like an online op shop, an online thrift store. And some of it's about saving money, but it's also about what's often referred to as re-commerce or the circular economy, this vibe of being far more sustainable in what they consume. Now, interestingly, some research recently found that 2 in 5 items in a Gen Z's wardrobe were owned by somebody else before that Gen Z owned them. And those of you with teenagers in your families, you know this is increasingly a dynamic we're seeing with this group, and it speaks to their desire to be far more sustainable. This is also impacting where they want to work. In fact, a global benchmarking study by the crew at Randstad recently found how many Gen Zs would not take a role in a company if that company didn't have values alignment with them. And so these are things that, again, are front of mind for a lot of businesses over the next few years. Second thing we're seeing with Gen Z, they tend to be just a tiny bit praise-driven. Some of you groaned, I heard that. But we'll talk about why this is the case in a few moments. But like some headline data that gives you sort of the context to this. Some research recently found that 40% of Gen Zs would like to receive praise from their boss at least 3 times a week if that's cool. And some of you are like, are you serious? Once a year at the Christmas party is heaps. Just do your job, right? And this is, I'm not slagging off Gen Z. This is a reflective of the era that they've come through out of schools where, like every runner in the race gets a ribbon. And psychologists will talk about this group having an external locus of control, looking outside for that sense of validation as opposed to what older generations tend to have, which is an internal locus of control. I'll try harder, I'll apply myself, my reward is I feel good internally. If someone else notices, that's great, it's a bonus, but it's not why I tried in the first place. Now, interestingly, we're seeing this impact the language that's now being used in the corporate world. And can I be honest, I had to suppress an eye roll as Gen Y or millennial. I had to suppress an eye roll recently when I read this article that you can no longer use what they termed anxiety-inducing language with Gen Z. So for instance, you can't call it a performance review, that's too harsh. It's got to be called a connect session because that's like sort of nicer or whatever. But this is when I had to suppress the eye roll. You can't call it feedback because that's also a little bit harsh. Now it's got to be called feed forward because that's far more aspirational. And again, it's interesting, I'm seeing this catch on already as terminology in corporates, and it reflects sort of those different mentalities. And the third thing we're seeing with Generation Z is they tend to be just a tiny bit phone obsessed. So average use time for Gen Zs on phones right now, 6 hours a day. Like some of you are surprised at that. I thought it would be higher than that. I thought it would be more than 6 hours a day. And interestingly, we could talk about what they're spending their time on their phones doing. That's one thing. But it's just as important we talk about what they're not spending their time on their phones doing. And do you know the thing that they're typically not doing on their phones is answering them. Okay, and so, some of you know this. Like if you've got Gen Z kids, you know this. You call your kids and they won't pick up. They'll text you and say, what'd you call for? It's like, well, if you answered, you'd know. There's a genuine fear of picking up the phone. And so for an industry that is so relationship driven, that's tricky if it's just text messages and emails and IMs back and forth. Okay, but we see with this group a very, very different approach to using their phones. In fact, interestingly, one of the other things I've noticed with Gen Z, you may have noticed this also, they tend not to use voicemails. And so I had a Gen Z on my team earlier in the year and I rang her and she didn't pick up, of course. And I went to her voicemail, but instead of saying, hi, it's Amy, leave a message, went to the Optus standard thing like, you've called 0402. And when I finally did speak to her later in the day, I said, what's the go? How come you haven't got a welcome message on your phone? And she said, oh, none of my friends ever use voicemail, like ever. She said, in fact, the only people who ever leave me voicemails are you and my granddad. I'm like, awesome. But very different. So if you've got Gen Zs and you're engaging with them, don't leave a voicemail assuming that they will get it. They, in many cases, actually won't.